The last of the production effects I want to dedicate a full video to is reverb, after which I'm going to move to videos about mixing instrument tracks individually. After EQ and compression, this is the third of the critically important studio effects that you're likely to apply to most of your tracks in some form. Artificial reverb is designed to simulate a recording that's captured in an acoustically resonant environment. Modern recordings are usually done in soundproof rooms with damping material that isolates the noise from outside the room, but will also absorb the sound waves from inside the room instead of reflecting it back to create a natural reverb. This results in a sound described as being dry, so we use reverb effects to add back the reflections that we expect in an environment with normal acoustics. There are different ways to configure a reverb to achieve different sounds, but the end result typically is when you add reverb to a dry track, it expands the space that the track occupies, making everything seem bigger or wider. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how I use a reverb on the snare drum for one main reason. The snare produces a tight sound, and it's very easy to tell what's happening when you modify different reverb settings, so it's the ideal tool for a demonstration. So this is my snare. It's EQ'd and compressed as I demonstrated in the previous two production videos. I'm going to start by playing this track without any reverb. So it kind of sounds like someone's playing the snare drum in your room right in front of your face. Now if I turn the reverb on, now it sounds like someone's playing the snare from the other side of an empty warehouse. So how do we recreate this spacey effect? You see that I'm using a plugin here called Reverb, which is a simplified tool similar to using a reverb pedal or a reverb dial on an amp. But for the sake of demonstration, I'm actually going to use a more advanced tool, a plugin appropriately called Reverb. So the first thing you get when you load this plugin is nothing. It sounds exactly like it did when I turned the reverb off. That's because under the impulse response generation, I don't have anything loaded. So I need to add a reverb generator here. Now, when I play this track, it still doesn't sound very different. So the reason is at low reverb levels, the dry signal will overshadow the wet reverb signal. So my strategy with reverb is to start by listening to it in isolation. Then I add the dry signal back and fine tune it until you get the sound that I want. This is especially important if you're going for a subtle reverb effect. So let's listen to what this reverb sounds like at the default settings. It's pretty weak. So the main setting I'm going to adjust that modifies the spaciness of this reverb is this one called the room size. As I increased that value, we gradually went from something that sounded like it might be recorded in a garage to something that was recorded in a cave. So for me, values between 80 and 90 are the most optimal sweet spots. At minimum, I like to have my room size at 80. That sounds to me like presence of reverb, but not quite overpowering. If I need some extra space, then I'll boost it up to 90. Any higher than that, and I do find that the reverb is overwhelming and it kind of just saturates out, and it becomes the focal point of the music as opposed to something that enhances the effect of your sound. Snare is one of the instruments where I like a little bit extra reverb compared to anything else. So for this video, I'm going to keep it at 90. So let's slap back that dry signal and listen to how this sounds. So if you listen to a ton of DIY black metal at this point, a lot of people are basically done. The problem for me is this level of reverb sounds clearly artificial. I prefer when black metal is raw, and my definition of raw is something that sounds real and natural. And there are a lot of additional tools I can utilize to get me to that point. What I love about this plugin is that you get this nice visual of what your reverb sounds like. I'm a very visual person, and I do a lot of mixing with my eyes, so I find this to be helpful. So let's investigate what options we have. I can change the start position of my reverb so it lags it. The concept of that seems kind of unnatural to me, so this is really one of those more advanced techniques if you're trying to do something experimental. Next, we can also change the length of the reverb. You can hear that as I increase the length and dial that back down, it doesn't sound much different at all. And the reason is because I'm just adding more reverb to this tail end. And by the time the reverb has fallen off, it's too quiet and like the next note is coming in and overshadowing that reverb anyway. So really what this length is useful for is for trimming the end of the reverb. And of course, at a length of 0, you have no reverb, as you can see in this visual. I find that trimming the length cuts it off too abruptly. If you want to shorten the length of your reverb, there's actually a better tool you can use, which is this dampening feature. So let's have the reverb in isolation, actually. It makes a little bit more sense. So as I increase that dampening, it just sharpens the fall off of the reverb. So it's a more natural of a sound as opposed to cutting the length. Alternatively, if I set the damping to 0, then it makes the reverb stronger. So I do, however, find that having this at the default value of 50 is the most optimal. It is something that's worth playing with, though. Next, we have stereo width. So this controls how much your reverb pans outward when listening to it in stereo. So if I have this value at 0, then the reverb acts like a mono recording. And if I bring that out to either side, either 1 or -1, I don't hear a difference between either setting, so I usually have it at 1. It makes your reverb sound stereo. There's other stuff you can do, like you can pan your reverb. Again, not something that you would do under normal circumstances, but this is something that you could automate to create a really cool sweeping effect if you wanted to. Last, we have pre-reverb. So this starts the reverb before the note hits. This acts completely opposite to this start position. So if actually you set these two to the same value, then they'll cancel out perfectly. Again, it's something that doesn't sound realistic to me, so I don't usually play with this value either. So that's all of the options that's in this reverb generator. However, we've only scratched the surface of the options that we have here. I can add additional ones, and the next one I'm going to investigate is this filter, low pass, high pass. So there's two sliders in this generator. The low pass, where every frequency below this value passes through the effect, and the high pass, where everything above passes through the effect. So what that means is when this setting is maxed, the low pass is maxed, and the high pass is zeroed, then the entire frequency spectrum of our track passes through the reverb. Filtering your frequency spectrum is a must if you want to avoid those unnatural artifacts, especially that high-pitch hissing. So in my EQ video, I talked about how each instrument has its natural practical frequency range, which is what I like to boost with my EQ. A bass drum typically sits between 50 and 300 hertz. Guitars will range from about 300 to 6,000 hertz. Everything above 6,000 except for cymbals is essentially this hissing noise. And if you send it to your reverb, it gives your track this harsh, shrill sound from the high end. Likewise, if you include too much low end, then you end up with a muddy sound that can drown out your bass. So I like to start by mirroring the EQ values in my filter. So here I would set it between about 150 and 2000. Then I just fine tune these values by ear until I get a sound that's aesthetically pleasing to me. So that sounds a little bit deep. I'm going to gradually bring this up. So here at 4,800, I hear too much of that high end. Let me max this out just so we get a comparison of the difference. And I really don't like that shrill sound, so I'm going to bring this a little bit lower. maybe something like that. That sounds like a good reverb to me for the snare. And if I add the dry back. So that's probably where I would set this reverb to be. One thing to note is the filter has to come after the reverb. Obviously, if there's no reverb, then there's nothing that's going to be filtered. If I reverse the order of this, then you can see the reverb is not filtered at all. Whereas if I bring that down immediately, it's removed a lot of those high frequencies. So after I'm done filtering, I can come back and do things like trim the length of the reverb using this effect. Trim, gain, and stretch. A lot of these options are the same as the options in the reverb generator. It's just that now they're later on in the chain after the track has been filtered as opposed to before it's been filtered. So you kind of get a little bit more control over how you want your reverb to sound, at least when you're playing with the start position and the length, which I already mentioned I usually don't play with. But I can also do stuff like add gain, right? That makes your reverb louder. But the same effect can be achieved by playing with the intensity of your wet signal anyway. You also have the stretch, which can slow down or speed up your reverb. And like anytime you adjust playback speed, it's going to also change the pitch of your reverb as well. So you can use this to change your pitch. But again, you can adjust the pitch of your reverb using a filter. Personally, I don't think any of these options are really necessary unless, again, you're intentionally trying to experiment and create some sort of crazy, unnatural reverb sounds. I think a lot of these settings can be automated, which is primarily where this is useful. So I'm going to remove this because I'm not going to use it and see what else we have. So if you want to do some really crazy stuff, you can load a file, like a different reverb plugin into this reverb generator, which I think is cool. You can also normalize, which just makes your reverb louder. Again, you can achieve the same thing by playing with the wet and dry signals. And then lastly, you can generate an echo, which I think could be useful. So I'm going to demo this effect as well. So when I drop this effect and I play it, you get this terrible robotic sound. That's because the spacing of these echoes is way too short. 10 milliseconds is too small of a time frame to resolve anything. So I'm actually going to open this up to something like 60 milliseconds. And now it's... You can see previously at 10, we had all these echoes. And when I increase this to 60, those echoes disappeared. I'm only getting 2 echoes per reverb. That's because this length is too short. So the length encompasses the reverb. So the greater I set this length to, the more echoes I'm going to get. In a realistic situation, a reverb is only going to really bounce off a wall once, maybe twice. So I'm going to really adjust these times to get 2 echoes. So if I want to start with a spacing of 60, then I want my length to be between 120, which will give me 2 echoes, or 180, which will give me 3. The remaining settings that I want to change are basically the start volume and end volume. Of course, each time a reverb reflects off the wall, it's going to lose intensity. So that's what this setting gives you. And if I play it with the dry right there, you can hear that the echo effect is actually really subtle, unless you want to make it obvious, of course, by doing this. But as with all things aesthetic, the choice is yours. I personally don't think a reverb needs an echo. If I want to create an echo, what I would rather do is add a delay down the chain past the reverb. So ultimately, you can see that all I use in this effect is a reverb generator and a filter, which is why I don't use this plugin. It's the reason I use the Reverbate plugin instead, because if we look at the settings I have here, what I have are the same settings from the reverb generator, and then a high pass and a low pass filter. Again, I like to describe this effect as using a pedal. It's just a couple of dials. It doesn't have too many crazy experimental options because I'm not really looking to add those experimental options to my tracks. I like things to pretty much be bare bone, and I want my reverb to be present but not overpowering or distracting. Meaning that the last thing you do once you get your reverb configured to sound the way you want is to adjust the intensity of the wet signal along with your dry signal to get the perfect balance. So if I have these both at the same level, it's a little bit loud on the reverb. So I'm going to slowly decrease this wet signal by a couple ticks every time. So that's a level that I kind of like, -8 decibels. Let's go further down. And then down here at -15, it's a little bit too quiet for my taste. So my range of values, I usually like to balance my reverb between -8 and -12. Just like the room size, it's something that I tune depending on how much spaciness of reverb that I want. And on an average, I like to have it kind of around -10. So reverb at its most basic can be used to create spaciness, but there are other ways that you can configure it to your own taste. And if you want to experiment and you don't really know how to like start, you can actually look into these preset tabs and then choose one of these settings and then fine tune these values. Use them as a starting point. More than any other effect, I think reverb is an aesthetic thing. So it's really up to you to do whatever you want to get the sound that you're looking for.